Okay, my clock reads top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Tuesday, everyone. Today is supposedly known in some corners as Curmudgeon's Day, but you'll never know that after you spend some time with our guest. This edition of Green Builder Media's Impact Series, Game Changers in Sustainability, welcomes Richard Louv, journalist and author. Now, today's webinar is brought to you by the following generous sponsors, and they are BASF. Oh, my screen just went blank, excuse me. BASF is a leader in the construction industry. With more than 600 products serving 75 construction product categories, BASF offers the broadest portfolio of products used directly on construction sites or integrated into other products to improve the performance of construction projects. BASF is also a global leader in sustainability and corporate social responsibility, committed to constant improvements in safety, protection of health, and environmental conservation. Bio-based insulation. Bio-based insulation spray polyurethane products help to lessen the environmental impact of residential and commercial structures by sealing and insulating in one step. Bio-based insulation integrates rapidly renewable ingredients as replacement for a portion of the petroleum in many of their insulation products without hindering performance, and has replaced chemical blowing agents with water. DuPont. DuPont puts science to work by creating sustainable solutions essential to a better, safer, healthier life for people everywhere. DuPont is focused on dynamic science that generates real-world solutions. That's why DuPont is at the forefront of building science with brands you can depend on, like Tyvek, Sentry Glass, Corian Solid Surfaces, Zodiac Quartz Surfaces, and Kevlar. Green Builder Coalition. The Green Builder Coalition amplifies the voice of green builders and professionals to drive advocacy and education for more sustainable building practices. For more information, log on to greenbuildercoalition.org. And Uponor. Uponor is a worldwide supplier of radiant heating and cooling, plumbing, and fire sprinkler systems that provide energy and water efficiency to homes and businesses around the globe. To learn more, please visit uponor-usa.com. I'm Mike Collignan, Executive Director of the Green Builder Coalition, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. I hope that during the course of today's presentation, you'll submit questions for our guest. To do so, simply use the small box at the bottom of the Q&A. I'll review those questions and pose them to Richard during the Q&A time set aside near the end of the webcast. And now to introduce our speaker. Richard Louv is a journalist and author of 8 books about the connections between family, nature, and community. His book, The Nature Principle, Human Restoration and the End of Nature Deficit Disorder, offers a new vision of the future in which our lives are as immersed in nature as they are in technology. This future, available to all of us right now, offers better psychological, physical, and spiritual health for people of every age. He also wrote Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, and that book was translated into 10 languages and published in 15 countries. Louv is co-founder and chairman emeritus of the Children and Nature Network, an organization helping build the movement to connect today's children and future generations to the natural world. Between 1984 and 2007, he was a columnist for the San Diego Union Tribune and has been a columnist and member of the editorial advisory board for Parents magazine. In 2008, he was awarded the Audubon Medal from the National Audubon Society. Louv is also the recipient of the Cox Award for 2007, which is Clemson University's highest honor. It's awarded for sustained achievement in public service, and he has been a Clemson visiting professor. Among other awards, Louv is also the recipient of the 2008 San Diego Zoological Society Conservation Medal and the 2008 George B. Rabb Conservation Medal from the Chicago Zoological Society. Richard has written for the New York Times, Washington Post, the Times of London. He's appeared on NBC's Today Show and Nightly News, CBS Evening News, ABC's Good Morning America, and NPR's Morning Edition, Fresh Air, and Talk of the Nation. Finally, last April, Richard gave the closing keynote of the very first White House Summit on Environmental Education. Now, today's moderator is the widely recognized Ron Jones, president of Green Builder Media, and board chairman and co-founder of the Green Builder Coalition. My friend, take it away.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone. Richard, it is truly an honor and a pleasure to have you join us on the Impact Series. How are you today?
I'm fine, Ron. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
It's really an interesting opportunity for us. Very often on the Impact Series, we are drilling into all the business and building science categories that affect us in this sector, and we talk about energy and material conservation and life cycle analysis and so forth. And so it's really refreshing for me to have an opportunity to learn from an expert in the arena that you have staked out so masterfully with your writing and with your presentation. I wonder if you'd start by comparing a little bit for us the two books that Mike mentioned, Last Child in the Woods, and then the more recent, The Nature Principle.
The Last Child in the Woods was the book that came out first in 2005 and then updated in 2008. And the subtitle of that is Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. That phrase, nature deficit disorder, began as a kind of tongue-in-cheek reference, and since the book came out, it has pretty much entered the language. The publisher actually insisted that we take that phrase from the book and put it on the cover, and I resisted that, which shows you what I know about marketing. It tends to have worked, and people know it when they see it. I'm very careful to say this is not a known medical diagnosis. Perhaps it should be, but it's being taken more seriously as a concept, as a way of thinking about what's happening to our kids, but also what's happening to ourselves. And the American, National American Pediatrics Association, for instance, they gave the keynote in 2010 to the national conference, and 5,000 pediatricians were there. They're taking it seriously. They're actually starting to prescribe nature, some of them, to the families that they see. They give them what sometimes are called park prescriptions, for instance. So a lot has happened since that book came out. There has been a kind of movement that was already percolating, but now it's really taken off, I think, to connect kids to nature. The second book, The Nature Principle, came out recently. And the subtitle of the paperback is different than the hardback. It's Reconnecting with Life in a Virtual Age. It's really about all of us, not only about kids, but the struggle that we all have these days, I think, to feel fully alive in a technological era. And it's not anti-tech, but I do talk about a kind of equation, which is the more high-tech our lives get, the more nature we need. I think we're in kind of desperate search of a sense of balance. And that's true in the built environment as well as in education and healthcare and other sectors.
You talk about in the book how nature can, and to quote, boost mental activity or acuity and creativity, and also to strengthen human bonds. Could you elaborate on that a little bit for us?
Well, sure. I first started looking into this in the late 1980s when I was researching another book, and I wrote a chapter in that other book, the earlier book, called The Nature of Childhood. And at that point, pretty much it was anecdotal evidence about the disconnection between children and nature. Over the next decade or so, two sets of research began to emerge. One was about that disconnect and how drastic it was, how for the first time in human history, people really were withdrawing, their children and themselves to a degree from nature. And this has happened before, but this time it was unprecedented in the impact on daily life. So that body of evidence came forward, but also this are just as important, more important in some ways, body of evidence began to emerge. And finally, the people who study child behavior, but also human behavior in general, well-being, and started to look at the act of, in the room, the natural world on our lives, the quality of life, our health, particularly our mental health, physical health, our ability to learn, our ability to be creative and productive. And the evidence has been increasing even since I wrote My Child in the Woods. Really describes, I think, a hope scenario in which if we really create new environments, new kinds of schools, new kinds of homes, new kinds of neighborhoods, retrofit them, new kinds of cities. We can actually make a huge difference in human well-being, mental health, and physical health. Recently, I wrote it's actually on Huffington Post right now, a piece called Restoring Peace, 6 Ways Nature and Lies Can Reduce the Violence in the World. There you mentioned social cohesion. Some of this interesting research really shows that if we bring nature into biophilic design, for instance, into our built environment, we can will actually treat each other better. Some of the studies have shown that the parks that have the highest psychological benefits, the most psychological benefits to human beings, are the parks with the highest biodiversity. We need other creatures. We need to be immersed in nature. It's part of who we are. It really is part of our genetic makeup. And the farther we get away from that, I think the more difficult life gets, and in some ways, the more violent. That's not to say that nature itself isn't violent, but it does have this effect on families and communities of a kind of bonding that does happen when you increase the amount of nature in that community.
Richard, you also assert that by reconnecting with nature and sort of returning to that relationship that you described, that will help us to build smarter and to build more sustainable businesses and communities and economies. How do you think that works?
Well, I think there's potentially a new set of careers that are going to emerge, both in design and the creation of the built environment, but also in education, healthcare, et cetera. In the nature principle, I talk about what I call the new nature movement, which includes but goes beyond conservation. I make the argument that, if we're going to have the sustainability we say we want, if we're going to have the biodiversity we say we want, then conservation is no longer enough. Now we need to essentially create nature. As strange as that sounds, as of 2008, more people in the world live in cities than in the countryside. That's a huge moment in human history. It's unprecedented. What that means is one of two things. Either we will continue to have cities that lose their nature, nearby nature, and human beings will continue to be more alienated from the natural world, or it means the beginning of a new kind of city in which we decide that these cities, these neighborhoods, these workplaces are going to be as immersed in nature as they are in technology. And that's already happening here and there. It's happening in Western Europe and some of the eco-villages that are emerging. When William McDonough's work in the United States and around the world in China, et cetera, is showing how this can be done. It really opens up, I think, great opportunities for developers, for architects, for landscape designers and landscape architects to really provide a new way of life that goes beyond sustainability as it is usually defined. This is more than about energy efficiency. That's the bare minimum we need. This is about more than saving energy. It's about producing human energy through biophilic design and so on. And without going too long in this answer, as you know, Ron, some of the biophilic design studies show that workplaces that have nature woven into them, into the design from the beginning and then kept there in the workplace, the workers are more productive, sick time goes down, turnover gets better. We can actually be not only a healthier society, but smarter, more creative society if we have our nature within our needs, within our workplace, our neighborhoods. I
think that most experts agree, and the relationship between the built environment and natural environment has certainly been examined when we think about the workplace, when we think about commercial buildings, also when we think about public buildings, and more with medical facilities and certainly with schools. But I think that where we really haven't been examining this in great detail and with a broad discussion is in the arena of residential buildings, homes. And so I want to explore that a little more. When we were doing, I was researching some things in preparation for our discussion here, and I ran across a really interesting piece of information. I wonder if you would comment on it. It says that the ratio of farmers in the United States age 65 and older to those who are age 35 and younger is 7-to-1. So old farmers outnumber new farmers and young farmers by a ratio of 7-to-1. What does that tell us, or if anything, about the relationship that we have as a society with nature and with working outdoors and being involved in these kinds of enterprises?
Well, a little bit over 100 years ago, the American frontier was declared to be over in a famous speech, and it was ended. And they looked at the census, I think it was the 1880 census, and they looked at where the distribution of population was, and they said the frontier's done. And exactly 100 years later, the U.S. Census Bureau came out with a new report based on the 1980 census and said that it was the last report they would make on small farms, on family farms in America, because there were no longer enough to count or to matter. That is every bit as important, I think, a demarcation line in our history as the declaration that the frontier was over 100 years before that. Baby boomers may be the last generation to have somebody in the family. I mean, I had an uncle, other people had grandparents, et cetera, that, we would visit their farms. So my generation of baby boomers may be the last to have some kind of familial direct connection to agriculture as a rule. That's, again, huge in terms of the change in our culture. And that has something to do with this disconnect, quite a bit to do with this disconnection with the natural world. Having said that, we're also seeing another counter trend that is very hopeful, and that's the emergence of organic farming. That's the whole move to have food produced close to the cities in which it is consumed. It's the neighborhoods of Detroit, for instance, that are blooming now with community gardens. In my own city of San Diego, the Somali refugees have, as in many cities, are evidence of what's sometimes called immigrant agriculture, which happens in the inner city. All of this is really positive, and actually, the agricultural age may not be over. It may just be transitioning into something that some have called the new agriculture. And I think this is part of the renaturing of cities, the true greening of cities, and can very much be part of the planning for the built environment in the future.
It's interesting that you mention the baby boomers because also we see statistics that and prognosticators tell us that it's very likely that this will be the generation following the baby boomers will be the first in American history to actually not have a high standard of living and a greater longevity than their parents. I wonder if there is some corollary or connection that we could draw between the two things.
Well, I think there is. There's one of the reasons why certainly pediatricians, many of them, are taking this seriously because they've seen this coming for some time. They talk, we worry a lot about severe danger and we keep our kids inside and under protective house arrest. But meanwhile, if we want, and by the way, it is largely agitated or magnified by my own profession of journalism, by CNN or Fox. You watch those and you think that there's a stranger going to snatch your child on every corner. And that's because of the nature of the coverage of a relative handful of terrible crimes against children. That those stories are repeated over and over again. That's not to say there's not risk out there, but it is to say it's greater than we think it is in most neighborhoods. In any case, pediatricians know that, but they also know that if you want a real risk, if you want to look at a true risk to children, you'll look at child obesity. The children now are being given, many of them, too many of them, the same pharmaceuticals that used to be given to adults for diabetes. We're seeing not only kids who are suffering from obesity or overweight now, but the effects of that will last throughout their lifetime in terms of heart disease and all kinds of other maladies that are connected to child obesity. That has a lot to do with the fact that we're raising them on couches playing video games. They're not going outside as much. If they do, they go play soccer, which is great. But that's not the same kind of expenditure of energy that former generations did when they just ran out and made up their own rules and made tree houses and dug forts and were out there playing in nature, but also in their neighborhoods in an unstructured way. That tends to keep kids from being overweight far more than a few practices of soccer, as good as that is, after which the parents hand out potato chips and Coke. That's not a prescription for reducing obesity. Getting our kids outside and more active, and ourselves as well, is a prescription for that.
You remind me in what you're saying with a quote that came from Last Child in the Woods, where you reported that a young man, I believe, had said that he preferred to play indoors instead of outdoors because there are more electrical outlets indoors.
That's right. And, in terms of thinking about the built environment and the interest that developers and architects and landscape architects, landscape designers, and others have, and planners, urban planners have in this, and I believe it's an increasing interest. I was surprised after Last Child in the Woods first came out at the response of many developers. I got an email early after the first book came out saying it was from the president and CEO of one of the biggest, if not the biggest, residential development companies in the country, who said he had just read my book and he was profoundly disturbed by it. And I waited for him to attack me because I am a little tough on developers. But he didn't. He said, I want to do something about this. And he invited me to Phoenix to a group of about 80 developers and real estate folks, asked me to give my sermonette. I did. I prepared to run. And then he stood up and did something remarkable. He said, I want you all to go into small tables. I want you to solve the problem. How can we create residential communities in the future that actually connect kids and their families to the natural world? And everybody went into small tables, and the room filled with noise, happy noise. Now, this is before the recession hit. It was happy noise. But they were really excited about this question and how to solve it. And they came back with some great ideas. A few months later, Clint Eastwood brought me to his ranch in Carmel, and he brought some of the biggest developers in California together. And we had a workshop, a full day of workshops on exactly the same question. Again, this is before the recession hit and all the development kind of stopped. But at that point, I think there was a lot of recognition, and I think it's still there, that there's a great opportunity here. I mean, developers at that point already, and builders already knew that baby boomers really aren't that fond of golf courses when they move into so-called senior housing. What they want are hiking trails and nature trails. So they already knew that there's a potential market there. And I think that there really is. I think that there's a new way of looking at our residential communities. And I always emphasize in those meetings with developers and architects, let's not just look at the outskirts of town. Let's not use this as another excuse for sprawl. How about if we started redeveloping the decaying rings of the existing older suburbs and all those some of those redundant shopping centers that are emptying out now? But if we replace those with the kind of eco-villages that emerged in other places in the world that actually have higher human density but more quote-unquote natural habitat? What if we did that? Yeah, wouldn't our cities be more interesting places, more walkable, healthier, just greater to be? That'd be a better future. And I think that there's a lot that people can learn about the environment for the future.
Well, I think you're right, and my experience in this industry, in this sector, tells me that there are a great many people who have a higher awareness. You were careful to mention there that this was prior to the economic challenges that we've had recently, and I have to say, in fairness, that I just came from the board of directors meeting of one of the largest organizations in the building arena. And once again, the hand-wringing took place on the board floor, and one fellow said that the biggest challenge to the industry, of course, would continue to be those extreme environmentalists who, if they have their way, will see to it that we never build another house. So I think that the actual opportunity must lie somewhere between hope and despair. It seems like we're sort of forced into one of those two camps, but I suspect that you lean more towards hope, but also with the fact that you have analyzed this and come up with some ideas that might actually work.
I always like to quote Ray Bradbury, who I interviewed many years ago. He was asked if he was an optimist or a pessimist, and he said neither. He was an optimalist. He wanted to optimize the future. And I think it's a false dichotomy between the environmentalism and the creation of the built environment. If we look at this as a great opportunity, and again, the market surveys show that people want something more than the kind of stucco wastelands that they've been given in past decades. They want something better than that. These developments may have to be done on a smaller scale than the massive developments that certainly in San Diego that took over the landscape in the 1970s and 80s. It may be more redevelopment of existing and Kane neighborhoods. But I think this is a great opportunity for nature-smart workplace architects and engineers to do new kinds of workplaces. I think it's a great opportunity for people to build skills that actually stimulate learning and stimulate creativity, as there's research is suggesting that more nature in those schools does. It's a great opportunity for nature-smart, even yard and garden specialists to turn yards throughout a city into native plants. There's a lot more market for that right now than there certainly was in the past. I think there's a market for new kinds of urban planners and new kinds of developers like the ones that I met right before the recession, who see this as an opportunity to give people not only more houses, but a better quality of life and not only energy efficiency, but the kind of life produces energy and increases their health, and it can be marketed in that way. I mean, the developers I sat with and worked with at Clint Eastwood's and elsewhere saw this as an opportunity to market a new kind of set of amenities. I think this is neither hope nor despair necessarily, but it's opportunity.
You know, you mentioned a couple of times that it's not just about energy, and I would agree, and it's certainly not just about what we call sticks and bricks. It's not just about the physical structure of a building itself, but I wonder if we could talk a little bit about your thoughts around transportation and infrastructure. Where do you see us needing to go in that arena?
Well, I would add a bit in what I call restorative transportation and the nature principle. Obviously, more of a greater variety of types of transportation is a good thing. In terms of and more bicycle paths and walking paths and nature trails through a city, all of that creates a much better quality of life. More parks. I mean, we know that the price of real estate goes up next to parks, next to urban parks. That's a good thing, for the people who build those residential communities next to urban parks or redevelop those neighborhoods. In terms of infrastructure in my own city of San Diego, there's a lot of talk about building very, very expensive, as in many cities, new ways to get street water runoff out of the city. And, they forget that the San Diego, for instance, is laced with these urban canyons that do this naturally. And so there's an effort now to see those urban canyons as a kind of discontiguous San Diego Urban Canyonlands Park, that if we name it, we'll protect all those canyons and see those as an amenity for the people who live in including the inner city. But they also happen to work quite well in terms of wastewater or runoff water, rather than spending all that money on a whole new concrete system. So I think that the natural systems, the natural watersheds work for us in terms of this infrastructure. And also improve the quality of life for the people who live around them.
It's interesting because at the same time we see news reports almost daily of navigation issues in the Mississippi, for example, because of the impact that the drought is having on water levels and so forth. It's a moving target, it seems to me, and it's not something that is going to be easy to solve or that is going to be a static resolution. One of the things that that I think separates your work from others in this field is that you seem to focus on not the things that we cannot do or that we need to stop doing, but you tend to focus on the things that we can do and should do. What would you say to those who are gathered here today that is the most fundamental thing that they need to do in order to get started in a movement toward a more realistic connection to the natural world?
I think the most fundamental thing is to be very careful about how we talk about the future to our kids and to ourselves. You just mentioned the moving target, the delta, et cetera. That's very true. I mean, climate change is going to change things. In the Netherlands, it's built underwater. All of that land was essentially lifted or created in the Netherlands, the farmland there. I visited there when Last Child was brought out in Dutch, and their plan for climate change, and they're looking at the straight, the waterways, the straight canals, et cetera, that go into the agricultural areas. And they're, as I understand it, planning to put curves into those canals, those waterways, to slow down the tide as it comes in. And within each of those curves, they're thinking about, or many of them, they're thinking about actually putting houses for the first time, residential developments, because they're going to build wetlands there as well as houses, and it'll be a neat place to live. So the wetlands themselves will serve to deal with some of the potential flooding. The curves in the waterways will create new opportunities for residential housing. And so they're turning this threat into an opportunity. In terms of how we look at the future, I've become convinced in recent years that I think that most Americans, maybe most people in Western cultures, right now, if you were to ask them to conjure up images of a far future, what would it look like? And I think that they would probably come up with images that look a lot like Blade Runner or Mad Max or The Hunger Games, a kind of post-apocalyptic future in which nature has been stripped from human beings, along on humanity, or so unalterably changed it's no longer nature as we know. I think that those are the dominant images that most Americans carry around in their heads about the future. I think we have to have. We can't do away with, obviously, with dystopic literature, which, by the way, dystopic fiction is now the #1 young adult fiction genre. It's bigger even than vampires, is dystopic fiction about painting a post-apocalyptic vision of the world, of the future. If I'm right, And if that is the dominant image we're carrying around in our minds, then we'd be best to be very careful. You know, the saying, be careful what you wish for, it just might happen. Be careful what you imagine, it might just happen. We have to have an alternative. You know, Martin Luther King, in many ways, demonstrated that any movement, any culture will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to. His speech was not called "I Have a Nightmare." The civil rights movement never pulled back from for an instant telling bad news about the injustices at that time. But it also balanced that with a hopeful view of the future, a view of a potential future, a dream that King described. We're not going to get to sustainability unless we aim a lot higher than that. I was talking about this in a speech once to about 500 high school kids, and a girl in the front row stood up and said, well, this is nice, Mr. Louv, you talk about King, et cetera, but what's your image in the future? And I said, well, I wrote 2 books about this. And she says, well, I don't know how to read your books. Just tell me. And so I gave it a shot, and kind of shotgun version of that, and I came home and I wrote it down. And we put that in the paperback edition of The Nature Principle. Just paint this outrageously idealistic picture of what a nature-rich future could look like, what nature-rich cities might look like. I acknowledge that this is outrageously idealistic, and in fact, that's the point. If we aim a lot higher than sustainability, as in energy efficiency, we won't make it to sustainability. People who deal with the built environment can tremendously paint that picture of a world we want to go to. And I can tell you, I've spoken to a lot of college students with them in recent months. I remember sitting with a set of several college students at DePaul University, took me to lunch. These were kids who were dedicated to environmental studies, but they were feeling a sense of despair. One young woman said that, she said this remarkable thing. She said, I'm 20 years old. All of my life, I've been told it's too late. I thought about that for a second. My God, all of her, that's true. All of her, she's 20 years old. That's the dominant message that she's been hearing, that many of us hear from media, from environmentalism, et cetera, from different sectors. If we don't have a balancing vision, as idealistic as it might be, to that dystopic image of the future, we can be assured that we will, in fact, be moving toward a kind of dystopia. And I don't think that's the future we want. When these college students start talking about the potential of a nature-rich future that's better than now, it's more than survival, they get really excited. A different look comes into their eyes than if they're only talking about saving energy. I really deeply feel it's the direction we need to go. Architects can lead the way, builders can lead the way, urban designers, urban developers can lead the way, and we can get there.
Let me sort of pose a question out of left field, if I may, because you did mention Dr. King and his work and his words. I think that it'd be fair to say that you have inspired a great many people in your life with your work. Who has inspired you, and specifically, who would you recommend that others look to for the written word to draw that inspiration?
Well, I think in terms of the built environment, certainly Frederick Law Olmsted. I mean, anybody who visited one of his parks and realized, you know, he thought 40 years ahead. It used to drive the city fathers and city mothers nuts because he could see what that park would look like in 40 years when he planted those small trees. And they all wanted it to happen instantaneously. I think he's an inspiration. I think E.O. Wilson is an inspiration of Harvard, who talks about his biophilia hypothesis, which holds that we are hardwired as a species to have this deep affiliation for the rest of the natural world, and that we need it. I think that Martin Luther King, in terms of making sure that the despair that was rightly felt by many people about civil rights was balanced with this potential of this dream, of this outrageously idealistic idea that maybe sometime in our last lifetime there would be an African American president. I mean, it's new in 1963 during that speech that might come true. It seemed idealistically, it seemed improbable then. And in so many other ways. Now, we've got a long way to go, but I think that those are the people, among many others, who have inspired me. But I have to say that I meet these inspiring people around the country all the time. I mean, the people who are working on this, what's now called the Children in Nature movement, who are working at the regional level, at the national level. They're starting family nature clubs around the country to get multiple families to get together, to go to the park, to get their kids some safe experience in nature. They inspire me. People of both parties have come to this. I mean, just last week, Laura Bush, former First Lady, came out and spoke, wrote an op-ed about nature deficit disorder and how we needed to reverse this. Michelle Obama has done the same thing with her campaign. We've had two Secretaries of Interior, one Republican, one Democratic, who have taken this on as an issue. I mean, this inspiration is everywhere out there. And anybody who goes to the Children in Nature Network website, by the way, which I think is on the screen, the link to that, will be inspired by what they see happening all over the country. We've got a long way to go to reverse this, but at least for many kids, it is already being reversed.
Well, you bring up another interesting subject area, and I'm going to ask you about that in a moment. I do want to let Mike know that, Mike, I'll ask one more question, and following Richard's response, I will look to you for some comments and questions from those in attendance.
That's fine.
Okay. So Richard, you mentioned the public arena, and I'm really interested in your thoughts on the role of public policy and regulation in trying to move in this direction. How do you see public policy affecting the nature movement?
When I was a newspaper columnist, quite a few years ago, I would beat up on developers quite a bit. And over time, I got a more sophisticated view of that, which was there's a kind of closed loop that developers find themselves in. They're part of, what creates the future of residential and commercial development, but so are the financial institutions that are quite limited in what they will give loans for. At least in the past they have been. But then there's also, as you say, the public policy. For instance, it requires roads be a certain width, and sometimes for good reason, to accommodate fire trucks, et cetera. But the kinds of restrictions, regulatory restrictions that, in fact, some urban planners put into place don't exactly work if we want a diversity of types of neighborhoods. So I think that the public policy has to really look at the kinds of choices that are available to developers. We can't just, blame developers. There has to be a look at the overall system in which they're building. In addition to that, I think that we have to look at the kind of public policy that encourages communities to take over their own services. The kinds of walled communities. I wrote a book in the early 80s called America Too that looked at the rise of private governments and the rise of what later became called edge cities. And, the rise of community associations, which sometimes are the developers' worst nightmare, that control people's lives in ways that we would never let public government control. The color of their curtain liners, whether or not they can plant a vegetable garden in the front yard or the backyard, the kinds of restrictions that are put into place by that. Now, that's a kind of private policy that is enforced by public policy. If we're going to have the kind of communities, the kind of nature-rich communities that I believe many developers do want to move toward, and builders and architects, we really, as you suggest, I think, got to look at that public policy and look at what it encourages.
Thank you. You know, this is a really rich discussion, and I have many more questions, but I do want to turn it to Mike and see if we have some questions from those who have joined us today.
Yeah, Ron, we do. And in fact, the first one up is kind of connected to what Richard was just talking about. It comes from Diane. There hasn't been a lot of new developments. They're starting to come back, but her suggestion to people is to use their own yards to bring back native plants and the habitat that they support. She feels it's doable. It replaces some of what we've lost by creating what she calls the green deserts that are grass. And she asks you, Richard, are you familiar with Dr. Douglas Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home?
He's actually a friend, and I promote his book all over the place. It's a great book, and he's a great guy. He and I actually appear sometimes on the same events. And in fact, he has an idea that I write about in the Nature Principle. This idea of turning yards into areas of native species. He is quite eloquent in describing that, the importance of that. He says, gardeners have far more power than yard owners have far more power than they know, that if we really care about biodiversity, we won't just care about the Amazon rainforest. Well, we will look at the desert of our yards. And his book really describes how beautiful these yards can be. My wife and I decided, or she decided for me, because she usually decides to practice what we preach more than I do, to turn our own into native species. And we've done that. We were out there one day kind of struggling with which plants, where do you go to find out your own bioregion? And I emailed him and I asked him for my own bioregion. He sent me back some suggestions. But I said my wife had this idea of, some of these plants can help bring back butterfly migration routes. And what if she said, what if next holiday season, instead of taking jars of jam around to the neighborhood, how about if we take native plants or seeds around the neighborhood and suggest we all plant them and create a butterfly zone, a butterfly neighborhood zone? And I told Doug that, and he says, well, I got a better idea. He says, what if you did that in your yard and somebody else did that in your neighborhood, and then the next neighborhood over, and the next neighborhood over, maybe a couple neighborhoods from that, and then maybe the next city over, and essentially create wildlife corridors on private land. Now, this is the kind of wildlife corridors that big animals move through necessarily, but insects do, and they increase the amount of biodiversity. They help everything that is helped when there's greater biodiversity, including our psychological well-being, which I mentioned earlier. And then he said, what if that happened throughout the country? What if we decided to build the first homegrown national park? We could start it right now. We don't have to wait for an act of Congress.
Richard, I want to interject one of my own questions here. I don't usually do that till the end, but it pertains to what we were just talking about. It also pertains to what Ron was asking or talking about with public policy. I just wrote a column not too long ago about the hurdles that HOAs and their architectural review committees can pose to sustainable choices. And a friend of mine, Tracy, she mentioned that there are not just neighborhood association restrictions, but actual city ordinances that can sometimes prevent exactly what you're talking about, planting your front yard of natural plants and trying to create a natural habitat. So I guess that follow-up question, similar to Ron's but different, is not just the public policy side, but how do you suggest we change the minds of these, I'll say, just small private groups, many of which really have no building industry experience or background whatsoever?
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, in Last Child in the Woods, one of the first chapters is called The Criminalization of Natural Play. And it looks at not only the power of city regulations, to prevent tree houses, et cetera. I mean, they'll actually come around and tear down tree houses. But the rise of these community associations and homeowners associations that sometimes are abusive with their power. I mean, at an early speech I gave right after Last Child came out, a woman came up to me and said, she was in La Jolla, and she said that her community association had recently outlawed chalk drawing on the sidewalks by kids, which I think she must have thought led to cocaine abuse. I don't know, but, or she didn't, but the people who passed it. I mean, we've really gotten a little crazed with this, as you know. And it's not only a government regulation problem, it is a cultural problem, because this culture of fear really, I think, is where much of this comes from. This fear we have of people who are not like us, the fear we have of crime, the fear, generalized fear that we suffer from, creates a kind of need for control in people that really, I think, often gets out of hand. So there is a counter-trend, though, happening, and I report on that in the nature principle of people who are beginning to really demand that they be able to have backyard gardens and even front yard gardens. I mean, you see these horror stories all the time. There's a Florida community association that actually tried to outlaw outdoor play by kids. It's hard to believe, but it was well covered. So there is a pushback to that, and I think that the more we can kind of imagine this different future of different kinds of nature-rich neighborhoods that really help our psychological well-being and help our physical health and help our ability to be fully alive, I think we will see change. We're already beginning to see some of that change. And by the way, I wanted to mention that in terms of architecture and built environment, one of the tests, I think, and I wish that LEED would look at this a little more in their categorizing of types of architecture, in terms of green architecture, which is a neighborhood or development, a home, a school, to the extent that it excites the human senses, it makes and helps people feel more alive. I think that that's a good test of whether architecture or neighborhoods or cities are moving in the right direction. Do they act to excite the human senses, or do they act to push them down and inward? We have a society that we live in now where we're spending a lot of energy pushing away the use of many of our senses. We stare at that screen all day and we disappear into the internet. We try not to listen to what's around us, not to have our other senses activated, but just fall into that internet. The people who study, the scientists who study human senses no longer talk about 5 senses. They talk about conservatively as many as 10 and as many as 30 human senses. Without going into those, which I do in the nature principle, the more we use those senses, the more alive we feel. Shouldn't we be creating a society that helps our kids feel more alive and ourselves feel more alive? Or do we want a society that makes us feel less alive? That's really the choice that the people who are creating the built environments, I think, have before them.
And the direction you went there at the end led into the next question almost perfectly. Darren wants to know, what can urban teachers and schools do to connect students to nature?
Well, urban schools, many of them are already moving in this direction. By the way, in both books, I spend more time on thinking about cities than I do about wilderness. I talk more about nearby nature. Even in the densest urban neighborhoods, there is nature, and there can be a lot more of it. And I'm not talking about, neighborhoods or schools that are all open space. I mean about, using roofs for habitat and creating schoolyard gardens, for instance. That's really caught on in many parts of the country, the schoolyard gardens. But also bringing back field trips, which have been diminished dramatically in recent decades as school budgets have been cut back. Many school districts have cut or reduced or even completely cut recess with this idea that kids are going to be a lot better off if they spend all day sitting at a desk taking tests. the literature, the scientific literature on this suggests just the opposite, that you have to get kids out for recess, you have to get physical exercise, you have to get all of that, and you can very much enrich their ability to learn and be creative if you get them out into nature. So I think there's a lot of educators who are thinking along. I know there are a lot of educators that are pushing for that now. They've got a lot to push against, though. Early after Last Child came out, I realized that one of my few speech guaranteed applause lines is when I said, but what we really need is leave no child inside movement. And the teachers and the parents who are terribly frustrated with the testing mania and the no child left behind approach to education reform really responded to that. They know that the whole community needs to be a schoolyard, not only that closed classroom where kids sit at a desk and take tests all day.
As a follow-up too, Richard, Darren wanted to point out that the Living Building Challenge, which is a relatively new green building program, they do have a requirement for a connection to nature and biophilia.
And I need to learn more about that after we get off. That's terrific. In fact, I recently met William McDonough, who wrote this wonderful book, Cradle to Cradle, about the recycling of everything. That we should recycle everything that is organic. And he's a designer, and as many of you listening to this know, I visited his office in Virginia for the first time, and we spent morning talking. And I noticed the architectural design that was sitting on a table, and I really caught my eye and imagination. I went over and looked at it. Later, he sent it to me, he rolled up a card I received, and he signed it with the word hope on it. What it was an architectural drawing, a big architectural drawing of a hospital that he's working on the design for in Spain. It has three sides. One is the whole side is solar panels done in the colors of a butterfly that is about to go extinct in that bioregion. The other side is a green wall, and then the third side is a vertical farm that will feed the people in the hospital, multi-story hospital. Here's a building that is not only saving energy, it's creating human energy through the food it raises, but also by we know that people in hospital beds who have a view of nature and some kind of green literally get well faster. And this is one of the reasons why healing gardens are being put into so many hospitals. But not only are they saving energy in that way and producing human energy that way, but they're taking the next step in this design. The whole bottom floor is glassed in. Anybody who walks into that hospital, if it's built in the future, butterflies will light on them. The butterfly that's about to go extinct in that region. They're going to make a community ritual out of it. They're going to turn it into essentially a butterfly factory, that bottom floor. And in season, when they start to hatch out, come out of their they tend to do this in a synchronized fashion once a week. So they'll open the doors and they'll make it a community ritual and let the butterflies loose. They're not going to stop there. They're going to go to all the communities, all the schools in that city, all the businesses, all the churches and synagogues and mosques in that community and say, you can do this too. We can bring this butterfly back. So here's a building that is not only saving energy, it's producing human energy, and that's taking the third step of creating life, giving birth, and helping bring back a butterfly migration route and bring back a species that's about to go extinct. Now, no one building can save everything, but that's a neat metaphor, I think, for the kinds of cities and civilization we could someday have.
If you don't mind taking another one, Richard, because I think it really ties into what you were just talking about. This one comes from John. His question is, given that we're largely stuck with our existing buildings and infrastructure for the near future, I mean, obviously it's a large overhaul to try and change all that. So in the near future here, what do you think are the most important transformations needed to avoid what you were talking about before with that dystopic future that all the kids are reading about?
I think we have to risk being made fun of because we're idealistic. I think, obviously policymakers, uh, educators, journalists, developers, architects, landscape architects, we have to take that step. We have to risk being seen as being wild-eyed idealists. If we don't do that, if we can't see what we would like, we won't even get close to it in terms of the future civilization. But in addition to that, I think what's happened already, there are now over 100 of these regional campaigns to connect kids and their families and their communities to nature around the United States and in Canada. Many of them are state campaigns or provincial campaigns. These are bringing people together that normally don't want to be in the same room. Just last week, Laura Bush came out and wrote an op-ed about nature deficit disorder. Michelle Obama has moved in that direction. I've seen developers at the same table as conservationists and environmentalists talking about the fact that they don't want to be in the last generation where this is considered normal and expected for kids to have a chance to have that wonder and awe that comes from an experience in nature. Religious organizations playing a role, can play a much role in the future. It doesn't seem to matter what somebody's politics or religion is. They almost always want to tell me about the treehouse they had when they were kids, or that special place in nature that's still in their hearts. Once that conversation opens, all kinds of things become possible. Then you really begin to imagine a very different future, one that connects people to nature, a nature-rich future. So I think that is the most important thing, to have kind of the courage to be idealistic again. It's not easy now, but it's possible.
Okay, Ron, we are out of questions for our guest today.
Well, that's perfect timing, and it's also a wonderful way to wrap up on that note of inspiration. Richard, thank you so much for the generous sharing of your time and your wisdom, and let me just say what an honor it's been to talk with you and to listen to some of the things that you have been trying to share with the world for all these years. I highly recommend that our attendants, those in attendance today, take up the Nature Principle and your other books, and I look forward to another opportunity to exchange ideas with you whenever that's possible.
Well, thanks, Ron. Thanks to everybody who came to this webinar. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Will you be speaking at a public event anytime soon that you could encourage people to attend?
Well, there's a bunch coming up in February. I'll be in Texas a lot. But the one associated with this topic is the Congress for the New Urbanism. I'm the keynote speaker, and I can't remember which month that is, maybe in May or April. But I'm going to get to talk to and with a lot of folks who are really, shaping the future in terms of the new urbanism. And I'm excited about being able to do that.
Very good. And is there a website that we can direct folks to that would help us to find out more about your activities?
Sure. Actually, my speaking calendar is on both of these websites, both childrenandnature.org and richardlouv.com or theNaturePrinciple.com. That will work too.
Excellent. Thank you again. Thank you, Mike, and thank you to all of you who joined us today. Richard, I hope we talk again very soon.
Oh, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Ron, we need to take one more opportunity to thank our sponsors,
Okay.
BASF, Bio-Based Insulation, DuPont, the Green Builder Coalition, and Uponor. I do want to thank our audience. They were great today, providing great questions, and I don't know if Richard's still on the line or not, but Diane wanted to pass along a quick note. Says she's going to see you in November in I think Shepherdstown is where she said. Yeah, Shepherdstown.
Oh, great.
So look for Diane there. Stay tuned to your emails, everyone, for announcements on future editions of the Impact Series. We're working to finalize the details on a few more guests, And I can promise you, you are not going to want to miss out on those. So we hope you'll join us next month for another edition of Impact Series, Game Changers in Sustainability. Everyone have a wonderful day.